Welcome to AI for Good, the leading, action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by the International Telecommunication Union, the United Nations Agency for Digital Technologies, in partnership with 40+ UN sister organizations and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify innovative applications, build skills and standards, and advance partnerships to solve global challenges. In today's AI for Good event, we are counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished facilitators and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Okay, hello everyone. Let's welcome today's speaker, Victoria Kumarin, who is the executive director and co-founder of the nonprofit Quantum Village. Their mission is to help people more readily engage with the quantum technologies. They've succeeded in doing so by organizing a variety of highly successful events, such as the world's first quantum capture the flag competition, as well as providing wider access to the quantum hardware. In today's talk, Victoria will be discussing how quantum can shape the way we express ourselves creatively. Let's please welcome Victoria.
Hello. Shall I get going, Ryan?
Go
All
for it,
right.
I think.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Okay, so today we're going to kind of cover a whistle-stop tour, how we might look at using quantum technologies or interpreting quantum technologies in a totally open sense, but also in context in terms of what else we have going on in the world. Just a little bit about Quantum Village. I think Ryan's already given a great intro. We are a non-profit. We kind of look at how you can approach quantum technologies in creative and kind of counterintuitive ways in terms of a different view to maybe an academic or a commercial view, and how we can bring different people from all walks of life into the wonderful world of quantum technologies. This gives you a bit of an overview in terms of kind of like what we're doing, where we're going. One of the nice and exciting things we get to do is organize the official Quantum Village at DEF CON, and we've been doing that for about 3-4 years now. We also have a little zine that we're launching, and maybe if you have some creative projects or ideas that belong there, that's a nice avenue as well. And we've also been, very fortunate to be creating some open source tools, including open source quantum hardware, such as a quantum sensor recently. What we really focus on is like kind of bringing people together from different disciplines and domains, and kind of create those sort of free and open spaces. Just a little bit about myself, and maybe this will be helpful, is that, I went to art school. So I think sometimes often when we look at quantum technologies, usually there's, a very scientific lens, and, that makes total sense given where quantum, science, quantum mechanics is coming from. It's coming from that world of academia and science. So that makes total sense. But how can we sort of take that onto a journey of application, as well as working with applications for machine learning and cybersecurity. I've also worked in finance. So looking at the kind of, I guess, the construct of companies and how they affect things and what their interests might be. And also from a cultural point of view, working at companies like LVMH, which was a lot of fun looking at that consumer journey. So in that vein, I hope to kind of guide you through on what might be useful. My co-founder here, that's not joining us sadly today, but is Mark Carney, and he's got a PhD in pure maths and comes with a very different lens, but is also a form of a professional violinist. So also that kind of like music creative vein coming through. So today it's really all about freeing the qubit, looking at how we can find these different ways, be it different tools or different practices practice, whatever you're coming with, on how you can sort of find your journey and sort of begin a way of expressing creativity. For a bit of context, I think, it's quite helpful sometimes just to define, what is art, what is creativity. I've sort of been saying, we've been decorating as humans for thousands of years. If you go to a cave, you'll see a drawing. If you look at broken pottery around the world, you'll see, embellishments and patterns and things. And, as humans, we've always been sort of enamored with that, where it might not necessarily serve a sort of functional utility or a purpose, but something a bit more subjective. And I think that's what's interesting when we're looking at technology, really is that application of science. It's that kind of like, how can we use, the sort of the latest knowledge of today, in a way that's kind of useful, and now we're going to look more at what we have today. Okay, I've got some funny slides. Well, the arrows are having a bit of fun, but this slide is really a very kind of crude overview. It's not supposed to be kind of rigorous and correct in terms of timeline and whatever, and maybe you want to create your own, but it's really just designed to show what are the different modalities that we've used for that sort of creative expression over the years. And kind of like, I've put AI at the bottom as this thing kind of erupting a little bit. And there are all these other little sort of facets, if you think about additive manufacturing, like 3D printing or something, like, it's something that, is a significant advancement and sort of, it's as useful to a hobbyist as it might be to an architect. And I think that kind of idea of expression and different modalities is what we want to think about, of these things being in concert, in union. They're not happening kind of separately. You might have a painting and you might have a sculpture alongside as part of your practice, in the same way you might be starting to look at robotics, or maybe creating a machine to create your art. You don't want to do it yourself. That's going to be your kind of new form of pen, if you will. I think probably it would be remiss not to delve into AI and like think about what does it mean to think about AI and art. I think having just read a little bit widely, and this is just a bit of a, my own AI slop of just like putting like what is out there, what's going on, what's important, what are the things making the headlines. Even Ada robot, managed to sell some art or sold itself for $1 million. That's quite a lot of money. When we think, I've got a picture of Beeple here, and we'll go into some of his work because I think he's the third, his work went to the third largest amount of a living artist. But also like when we're looking at AI, it's this question of kind of like ownership, creator, the impact both, I guess to the business of creativity, as well as like how can you use it for creativity. I just stuck in actually the latest issue of MIT Review that came through my front door, and it's actually very relevant. So maybe there are other resources that you can also have a look at, because actually when you're looking at emerging technologies, the same kind of themes pop up. So sometimes someone's already actually like been thinking about what is the meaning of creativity? I mean, even here it's questioning, is it meaningless? And I'm sure, journalists have been doing that for decades. But again, we've got reason to question that. Here we've got a lovely picture that actually I think won a photography award, and was generated using Midjourney, and this Jason, Mike, and Alan, he tried to copyright it quite a few times with the US, and it actually finally got rejected. And the premise here was that it was created by a non-human entity. And I think that's the key thing to kind of think about as well when we're looking at, is it the machine or is it the man? Who's making, who's creating, who takes that ownership, who owns that creativity, or is there a merge? Here we go. Here's the Beeple NFT that sold for 69 million. I'm not actually 100% sure if he's using 3D modeling as well as AI, but I think it might be a bit of both. But he is a very skilled artist, and I think for 13 years or something, he's been making a new image every day. So there's a huge praxis and practice that is going on as well. It's not just someone just sort of for 2 minutes, or maybe you could probably spin something up in 2 minutes, and who knows, maybe it could go at auction and reach these stratospheric heights. Refik Anadol, he's a Turkish artist. And I think what's really important to kind of identify here, this is him with his recent piece at the MoMA. I think it was 2023. It was there, and it was I was fortunate to go, and it was quite. What I actually found mesmerizing was how mesmerized the people who were viewing it were, which is actually a good thing to see, I think, is like people enjoying these new sort of modalities of emerging technologies being harnessed to create new paradigms of artistic expression. What's I think quite outstanding here, or something of note, is that this piece was trained on, I think, the whole archive of the MoMA, so the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I think it was sponsored by NVIDIA, so there was some hefty compute power. So maybe, and in your local kind of like high school, or your at home brew kind of like version might not be as big, but maybe you've got a different sort of, maybe you could do something on your family photos and create some meaning. So already there's these sort of ideas that we can start using. Now, of course, we've got the kind of really obvious, big protagonist in the story of kind of, computers and art, and who is the maker, who is the creator, and that comes from OpenAI. And I think here I'm just sort of illustrating that timeline of, having the former CTO say, maybe those jobs, those creative jobs shouldn't have been there in the first place. These people can do better things. Maybe they've found some more interesting things to do. Maybe they're doing quantum art. Who knows? And I think what's interesting to see is sort of within 6 or 7 months already, that the World Economic Forum is putting out a post, a report saying graphic design jobs are one of the most at risk at the moment. And then a few months on, 2 months ago, Sam Altman's going like, all these viral images, Studio Ghibli going wild is causing a meltdown. And there was all this interesting rhetoric because, I think probably, I don't know, maybe that's more reflective of my little sort of social graph, but I was seeing a lot of people, friends, colleagues having lovely new sort of anime style, as I think we're supposed to call it now, expressions of their portraits or art or creators. And, even here is a Microsoft, chip that someone has created. Forgive me, we do have some sources saved if you want sources for the images we've used. But this really just, again, sort of highlights, the kind of the fractions that are beginning, the cracks that are coming from this new sort of paradigm of creativity. Now, obviously there's we need to get to why we're kind of transitioning or exploring different computing modalities, but in the same way Sam Altman's saying help, the popularity of people wanting these generated images is actually melting his GPUs. I think also there was a report or someone saying that, like, please don't say please or thank you to your AI agent, because it's actually just wasting compute power, it's wasting water. So actually, if you can be forego your manners for a moment, and in the name of saving water, because actually there is a real energy crisis coming out of it, in that these sort of GPUs, these data centers are getting hungry, they're working overtime, and they're not powered off thin air. So what are we going to do about it? I mean, one thing to acknowledge again is that AI infrastructure boom, and I think this does feed into what we're going to be discussing around quantum technologies, quantum computing. And one of the drivers is that sort of presumed end of Moore's law, as we sort of shift with the transistor like getting smaller and smaller, and how can we still continue to build this compute power that we've been able to do over the last decades? And I think actually with the ingenuity and the precision, it's something we can do potentially, but maybe it's looking at different architectures and different approaches. And here is really just a rapid fire. We're not here to kind of go on a history lesson of computing, but really starting with the transistor in 1947 out of Bell Labs, and that really spearheaded all the computing that we've had access to, and all even our phones now being like these small computers that we have in our pockets. It's what a world away. This GPU here by NVIDIA is actually, I think, from one of their first, or maybe their first, from 1999. So that's almost 25 years ago, almost 30 years. NVIDIA is a 30-year company. So even when we're talking about building these compute stacks and these new shifts, they're not going to happen overnight. I guess it's a 30-year success story, but here we are. And then obviously we've got this chandelier, which is a pseudo quantum computer, which I'm sure you're already aware of. And here it kind of is just showing again how this might fit in. Like, I think there's a lot of, I guess, visuals where you could argue that you would have this classical stack over here and this quantum stack. But I think as the quantum computers are coming out of the lab, they're no longer sort of the sort of scientific experiments. They're becoming real hardware, real things that you can program. Let's start thinking about a QPU. Let's start thinking about that quantum processing unit and how it might integrate as we look into this like more probabilistic way of computing, these sort of, kind of AI token factories of the future. Will it be a QPU that helps? I've also added in some other kind of next gen ideas of computing. There are, all these other wonderful, weird things that are going on that, when we look at new ways of computing and we move away from that CPU, GPU, kind of like that parallel view, why are we doing that? Now, probably would be remiss not to highlight this. And this is just really like a speedy snapshot, as I'm sure, if you're already here, you've already probably done some of the Quantum 101s, or you're already kind of thinking about like kind of why is it important? Who are the key figures? And here we've got, Feynman, who really launched a lot of the ways we're thinking about quantum mechanics, for computing. In 1959, we also had David Deutsch, who was really spearheading that kind of quantum advantage, that quantum information theory. And then, of course, we have Peter Shaw, excuse me, who, in 1994, came with that killer algorithm of like factoring prime numbers. So actually, suddenly, it's not just this idea and this beautiful way of how we can process, and kind of simulate nature, but it's also like, here we've got something where this could be a real world use case. And now we're kind of on this journey to find more and see what else. Going back a little bit about this sort of unconventional computing, I get a lot of people asking questions because obviously the moment you say things like mushroom computing or whatever, it sounds kind of fun and unreal. But I think, there is this kind of idea of sort of like, how do we get closer to nature? If we want to cure these big hard problems about in the life sciences and so on, like how can we start thinking in a more natural way and less kind of sort of binary zeros and ones? How can we shift away? And just on a little fun note, because you'll see this when we discuss a few of the artists later, you'll see that this is just I found quite a fun extract, and this is from Bloomberg, and they were covering biocomputing. And what I found, and I just took a sort of screenshot, and it's sort of saying, quantum computing, that's old, that's like, decades old. We're new, we're the new thing on the block. So already there's this idea that maybe there are these new paradigms of computing and these fun approaches, and we're here to talk about art, so maybe there is something in there to sort of draw into your practice. um these are probably the last two themes outside of before we delve into quantum where we're looking at, when we talk about that kind of convergence with those arrows of all these different sort of modalities, what other things are sort of rising as well alongside quantum? And and this is not necessarily my opinion. This is I guess what a lot of reports and industry reports are kind of careering towards, and that's that synthetic biology. If we think about even in like a medical use, like could you have a synthetic heart or something like that? If you need some kind of life-saving, new organ or something, and you can't wait for a transplant, all these really cool things that are happening. And here is Amy Carl, who will come up again because she I think she's like sort of growing bone. And actually that was working with, scientists in California who are doing that as kind of regraphing. And that's one thing to think about. And then obviously robotics, because I actually think robotics in a funny way, it's already in the creative realm and it's already making the headlines. And here's the Ada robot as well. If I'm right, she was constructed, I think, by maybe an Oxford professor. But what I find interesting, if we break it down, is breaking down the technologies, and that's, with the eyes, you've got computer vision, so you've got the AI processing there, the sensing. And then you've got her arm, which is effectively a pen plotter, which I think some of the creative technologists out there who are listening have probably maybe dabbled with. And maybe that gives you an idea that, like, could you start building things with these adjacent technologies to help move your concept forward? So when you're creating your quantum robot, say, you want some quantum sensing, maybe a QPU, but also you can draw in some other kind of ideas as well. Um, oh. Great. And then when I'm looking at as well, just quickly is the soft robotics. So with soft robotics, I also think this is another nice way of kind of, forgoing just relying on silicon and also thinking about like other materials that we can use. And then here, just to finish off, we've got Merit, she's an esteemed quantum physicist, and she's also a ballerina, and she's dancing with a robot. And you could argue because when we start looking at all the quantum art, when you look at quantum art, if you just stick quantum or something, it applies maybe, but actually, is she entangled with it, or is what is the relationship there? And maybe there's something entangling with a robot. Who knows? Okay, so now when we're looking at, are you able to see my screen? Sorry. Yeah. Now when we're looking at sort of the classical and quantum information, this is just a really quick, speedy view of, moving away from this binary logic into this quantum logic, into this more multitudinal way of thinking, and how this new computation paradigm can help express things that we were never able to express before. Two key concepts, superposition and entanglement. We'll probably go into them a bit later. These are things as well that I think, because you can't do this on a classical computer, these are highly interesting and maybe in terms of creative practice, things that we might want to explore. Just a really speedy run because this is again not a quantum computing overview, but it's important to know what's out there and what might be accessible sooner rather than later. Just looking at the really common sort of, obviously we've got the superconducting qubit quantum computers, and you've got the Dilfrid chandelier thing that you're always thinking about, but the chips usually like that. Probably interesting to highlight here is photonic quantum computers. They're room temperature. One of the biggest issues is really having to create these sort of like a very sort of colder than space vacuums and things, and that's actually probably the biggest barrier. And maybe someone from the quantum computing side is going to say no, that's not, but it is something that inhibits the sort of ease of being able to just build a quantum computer. Here we have an esteemed researcher, Javier, here holding a spin cube machine, and these come from China. They're, I think, 2 qubit by 2 qubit NMR machines, and they're ready to go. So this is from an educational perspective. We're already kind of out of the lab, and you can experiment. Can you do something of use, of utility? I don't know, but actually, education seems like a pretty good one, and actually, maybe you could do some fun art, like you can get going now. Here again, just showing the different sort of more different kind of versions and styles of approaches that are being kind of touted and being built. Here's a nice chart from the Suter group, and superconducting is the tool. This is the biggest bar. The one that you see with the chandelier. There's good reason why you might associate that. That is the one that seems like everyone's kind of betting on. A key component again is to think about, how these quantum computers might work together. That this kind of interconnect is probably when we'll get that power. Like if you think about computers, when classical computers became really powerful, really useful, it was when we kind of had that interconnect and everyone was online, and suddenly you have this, mass adoption that perhaps when you're not connected, you don't have from that point of view. But also, there are lots of interesting things that you can do and these protocols. And I think protocols are things that we want to also think about, even when we're looking at art as well. Obviously, there's Q Dave. This is Mr. Dr. Peter Shaw. We've got to thank, and actually, how fantastic, because probably it's spearheading something that maybe people have gone, oh, you say it's going to help with these diseases, you say it's going to help with this, but is it really? We hear lots of promise from lots of different technologies. The valley of death when you're doing R&D, that is real. So at the same time, when we talk about Q Day, and this might not be the best slide, I think we do have some better ones, so apologies. But actually, it's kind of what you make it. And I think there are other ways that we can think about the problems, the hard problems that we can solve with quantum computers in particular, that actually would mean that Q-Day might be a really great day. And I certainly want to think that. Right. So back to like with the quantum computers, because we want to use the quantum computers to create art, and that's, what we're thinking might be this great bountiful future. The good news is they are also joining us on the cloud. So if you're already, got a S3 bucket on AWS or whatever, you're training some models, have a look at their other offering and look at the other providers as well. And there's lots of different companies, including IBM, that have very good resources where you can just get started with a little free compute and just test something out. They might not be that useful, but actually for art, perhaps it's the way. So dialing a bit back and then getting back into this idea about art, I think the key thing, and I think the brief a little bit for this talk today, and depending on where you're coming from, is, how is it going to impact art, culture, design, and all these different things? And maybe how is it already now? Because I think the word quantum, the nomenclature, is already quite familiar. You can get deodorant here, you can get loo roll, you can get dishwasher tablets, you can get a quite nice trainer. These are big. Big and plentiful companies, global companies, and quantum seems to really help hit well with customers, so that's a good thing. You've got games called Quantum Babylon, Quantum Slime, which looks really cool. They're not actually using any quantum effects. I don't believe they're trying to. I might be wrong. There might be fans out there that know about these games better than I do. But what's nice is that you're kind of seeing this like use and maybe, and I'm not saying this, but maybe abuse. And when we think about that AI slop from before, anyone can generate anything. Like, how long till we get to quantum slot? Because, if you're connecting the QPU to the GPU and you're still generating stuff like, and it's going to be so easy, are we going to be creating high quality stuff or not? Fear not. Quantum in the Arts is here because it's the International Year of Quantum. Lots of galleries around the world are creating events. They're working with esteemed artists who've got a good track record of kind of communicating something to the public that the public likes. So again, here we've got Google Quantum AI, who've been working with Laurie Provost. I might have mispronounced that. Forgive me if I have. And she's a French artist, very cool, creating, I think it's called We Felt a Dying Star. Here we go. And here she's talking about it. And actually, what's quite interesting about the whole installation, and it's in some fantastic location in Berlin. Unfortunately, it has just finished, but maybe they'll be relocating somewhere. And there's a lot of videos that you can go and listen and see how this artist, who's not a scientist, not a physicist to my knowledge, is kind of like getting her head around not just quantum science, but also quantum technologies, also quantum computing. She's creating some of these images, I believe, using a quantum AI model. So I don't know the details, but there's premise that the technologies are getting used, and then you've got the sculpture in the middle, which sort of moving around. There's quite a few, and I thought were quite cool because actually it looks like it's sort of made with like twigs, mud, and things that we could easily find. People are still, even though she's got the quantum computer, she still wants to work with nature, and I think that's the thing when you're thinking about building your creative practice. It's in concert again. It's not just something and nothing, although that could be your signature style. Maybe there's something there. I thought it was quite important to actually put a review here, and it was very well reviewed from what I could find. And actually, I think that, is saying something. The critics like it. So, when it comes to quantum and art, they're loving it. Now, I personally, and probably because I work in the field, I get bamboozled by it, and, everything's quantum, and you can just sort of go, oh, just, put a Q on it. It's quantum. There we go. Done. Hopefully that will pass. Everyone else seems to be doing it. And, when we dig deeper a bit about sort of different approaches, I think, actually thinking about, the quantum hardware itself as, an art piece, a sculpture. This is Google Quantum AI again. They had a skilled painter. I think they painted the whole sort of internal sort of room that it's been installed in their lab. But it's Yosemite in California, and it's for where the artist is from, and he's been, just painting away. And actually that's something, quite nice. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily pioneering or breakthrough, but everyone is entitled to their expression. So it doesn't matter if, you just stick to your 2-qubit device forever. Sometimes these constraints can help. Going back to the sort of the actual kind of dill fridge. This is actually, I believe, from a show, so it's not technically a real one. but it belongs to Hannah Fry, who's a very eminent mathematician from the University of Cambridge, and she's also a brilliant science communicator. So you probably have come across her. I think she's got a good documentary on with Bloomberg on quantum computing of all things. But she had this installed and sort of turned into a chandelier, an actual one. You know, she's gone ahead and done it. So, you know, if the esteemed mathematician is doing it, then maybe it's okay to sort of have this sort of you know, reverence towards these beautiful and often, you know, pieces of machinery. Now, because there is all this and it's all wishy-washy at times, and you know, you can just, you know, paint on the case of a Dilfrid and it's art, and you know, where how do we define it? And I think this is just an overview slide that we've made that I think is just there to kind of help kind of construct if you're approaching it and how you want to think about it. And it's sort of like, you know, are you just taking inspiration from quantum science, quantum technologies, you know, and expressing that as art? Do you want to go and do an oil painting of your, you know, the latest IBM quantum computer? I think it's called Heron. It looks a bit sculptural. Like, you know, what is it you want to do? Or do you want to write about your feelings? Or, you know, that's really open for interpretation. And I think for you know, decades, you know, artists have been doing that, and we'll see that you know, quantum science and art is, you know, that partnership, that union is well trodden. So the second one is now kind of like creating that sort of like generative, you know, creating some model that will generate your art, and you know, there you've got it. And already, if you go on, I think, GitHub, and you just like search for Google art, if you could just search for, oh, not Google, but quantum art, you know, you'll actually find a lot of open repos, and you know, a lot of physicists or researchers who just, you know, have tinkered around in their spare time. They've already got the expertise with the algorithms, and it might actually give you some ideas. You know, and there are a lot of open source projects. That's, you know, that other kind of chain. And then I think when we look at 3 and 4, this is probably where, when we're thinking about like, where are we going? What can we do? You know, how do we create that kind of quantum brush? How can we create things with quantum technologies that you can't do with classical technologies? Because otherwise we might as well just stay and, you know, I'll go home and we can end this presentation now. But really, you know, what can we do? What can we test out? And what makes sense? And then, you know, the fourth one is kind of this entanglement, you know, these quantum ideas, like how can we like physically do things that we can't do again, but kind of on a extra level where you can demonstrate that. And maybe that's, you know, this kind of quantum orchestra, but also maybe it's that interface. You know, how are we going to interface with art, with technologies? Is it going to be some kind of Neuralink? Are we going to be in some kind of pod in 10 years and not need our physical bodies? Like, I kind of hope not, but you know, there's that idea already when people are thinking about brain computer interface and user interface. Is like, how are we going to connect with that? And that's, you know, a very interesting area. This is just again that overarching kind of thing of like, how can we think outside the box? You know, what is a quantum art museum of the future going to be like? You know, you know, what happens with quantum robots? But like for creative expression, maybe they're creating your art or whatever. So just really kind of, I think also because we don't have these fault tolerant quantum computers now, there's this sort of like transition phase as well. And I think, you know, we have this nice time to think about like, you know, quantum instruments. You know, quantum computers are likened to instruments. So maybe actually, if, you know, the physicists doing the sort of hard science to try and solve really hard problems, maybe actually like creating a quantum violin isn't that hard as it sounds. Right. So quickly looking at resources, a great way to kind of get started, I think, is this sort of education lens. You know, quantum mechanics comes out of academia, and like there are all these wonderful people around the globe, like kind of looking at different ways on like kind of how can we translate these concepts? How can we make them interactive? There's this a really nice example of a beam splitter by Patrick, who's out of the University of Nottingham, and you know, he's using Lego, and I had the fortune of interacting that and demoing it at one of our events, and it was possibly one of the most popular things we've ever had because everyone loves Lego. And like, well, not everyone, but a lot of the people there did, and that was a really nice thing to see, because a lot of people who may not interact with, you know, physics, or maybe physics class gives them nightmares, this is a nice way that they can overcome that. We also have things like quantum chess, and other exciting kind of approaches, and I think we're going to cover that on the next slide. Right. So quantum games, I think this is one thing that's been, excuse me, it's been covered quite a lot. And that maybe is because like computer games are really popular. You know, it's a fun thing. If you're already delving into computers, you've already got them at the ready. Like, why not have fun with them? And so this kind of lineage is already there. And you can already see that people are kind of looking at how can we really kind of use these from an educational perspective and for a play perspective. There's Quantum Flytrap here, there's Quarks Interactive, where they've got this nice rundown of circuits. And then we've got Quantum Doom, which is actually, someone was able to run Quantum on, Doom on a quantum computer or like reprogram it. And, I think that's a nice sign from a social point of view um, that we're able to do.
Sorry about the coughing. I'll pop in while you're at that. We did have a question on the different ways that the art was developed. I think that's slide 30, wait, 34 in there. Somebody asked if you see the art development landscape as being linear or cyclical. Like, can the artist work on developing some art inspired by quantum and then easily traverse to doing like quantum and art at the same time? Do you think it's very easy for an artist to navigate?
Um, I'll go back to it. Let me see. Yes, I definitely think so. And actually, hopefully I can answer that question in coming slides. Because whoever asked the question, I think is like totally onto it in a really, really great way. Um, I think from a artistic perspective, and I think this is what's really important, like especially when you think about a paintbrush, they've been used for centuries, and actually they've had a lot of standardizing and perfecting, and we know that they work for a lot of people, maybe not for everyone but for a lot of people. And that's, I think, a really valuable thing, that just because, I don't know, perhaps you get a fancy blender in your kitchen, you're not going to use the blender all the time, or all the gadgets. Sometimes you'll just whip out a knife and just cut something up, or even you might have a dishwasher, but still you might just wash a dish in the sink, right? So I think that kind of workflow holds true. And then also there's a sensitivity where, um, you know, uh, actually, like some of these kind of more analog, more hands-on things, and I think we'll get into that, we are physical beings. So actually sometimes we want to interact in that way, in that physical way. Um, okay. So I will get back, thank you for the question, to the quantum games. So I think what's nice, and actually, unfortunately, I've got the Quantum Realm games is covering something that they worked on, and that was with Stephen Hawking and Paul Rudd, and they did a really great video, which was very interesting about, quantum chess, and taking these properties. And I think, you can even create card games. We've even created like a quantum key distribution card game. There's lots out there, there's ways in which you can use sort of different perspectives to kind of communicate these quantum properties, but also use it to educate. I think now we probably go into the quantum science in art, because I think this is the one that's had the most development. And then I think even when you look at it, when they've got all the fancy access, this is a chap called Robin Baumgarten. I believe he studied at Imperial in London. And actually he was commissioned, I think, by Aalto University. They've got a very cool initiative called Q Play Learn. And actually you've probably come across it if any avid like sort of quantum fans out there, because they've done a lot of these, and they sort of connect and sort of simulate the quantum properties. But the really key thing here is actually these little nodules. They're all door stoppers that you can get from your hardware store. And the reason I think it's important to highlight that is just to show that, you can be this sort of esteemed engineer or physicist or professor or whoever, but actually sometimes, you want to lean into that functionality, especially when you're engineering something or designing something. And to communicate doesn't mean you always have to reach for the sort of fanciest, pen in the drawer that's arrived. Okay, so there's other things going on, that we sort of addressed. There was that exhibition in Berlin by Lord Provost, and I think there are a few other artists included. Here's a nice exhibition that comes out of University of Nottingham. I believe they're going to pop up somewhere else, but Cosmic Titans looks both at, that kind of quantum science, and here is Conrad Shawcross, who is, an esteemed artist. I believe he sort of comes out of Oxford and has the joy of hanging out with all the cool mathematicians there, and you can already see these shapes and how we interact. And I think his work here, or some of it included, was really looking at sort of black holes and things like that. And I believe there were other sort of VR experiences. So I encourage you to check it out, because actually there you may get some ideas about, what's been done and how we can kind of move forward. Right. So let's blitz to kind of like quantum visual art, quantum art. I think one thing again, and this is, forgive me for this keeping on happening, but what I found very interesting was that sort of the pioneering piece for NFTs, if you remember the craze, and maybe they'll come back, or maybe in a new form, maybe it'll be quantum NFTs. Maybe that's something prudent for someone to look at. And that's really looking at this sort of, and I think this, the Sotheby's executive saying it will be the most historically important work of art, and it's called Quantum, by Kevin McCoy. And I think, it sold for almost 1.5 million US dollars, and that shows you maybe the value in the name, this kind of Mandela effect, this sort of spiritual calling almost for people in that sphere. But again, we're using that name, but to my knowledge, it's not necessarily quantum. I read through some of it, and if you're curious, you can too. And maybe there's sort of hints, and that I think for the sake of having that real clarity about your kind of quantum technology practice, we'll put that aside. But now we have Guillaume Verdon, who is a researcher from was at Google Quantum AI. I think he did something around his using like a neural generative AI. So he did stuff around like tensor networks there. And he's now got his own sort of hardware company and is doing very well there. But back in 2021, he was minting NFTs using quantum, processors to create that and tokenizing them. So, there is someone who's already, 4 years ago, if you're thinking about, what is quantum visual art, it's here. Like, does it look to you like this could not have been done classically? Obviously, we're in a paradigm where, really we can simulate everything, but hopefully that will change soon. So we've now got Libby Heaney, who I think is probably, one of the most pioneering, or certainly considered, artists. And I think when we look at her work, what's interesting for her that's unique in all of this, and we probably should listen to what she's saying, is that, she is a formally trained physicist. She's not, I mean, I believe she went to actually the same art school I did after, but she's a physicist. She's done lots of postdocs. She's done really serious, heavy quantum information theory. And here she is sitting, looking quite regal with a sort of, projected quantum computer around her. And I think that again shows that even, the serious physicist will the hardcore physicist will also be taken aback by the structure and the machinery of it in itself. She's used the quantum blur effect developed by James Wooten and IBM, and she's also, I think, used this for quantum slime. And I think I like the knit to highlight this one, because it made me think of the sort of quantum slime figurine and game. And again, these very different uses. I think the key thing here that I've kind of kept is, she's using QR codes. She's using VR to kind of, you can see AR, VR, all these other things that you have readily available, based on her work as well. And what I thought really interesting to the person who asked the very good question is, like, this is 3 days ago. She's going back to oil painting. So even after all that, and she's probably one of the few people on the planet that knows how to program a quantum computer, has access to the quantum computers, like, she's still looking at oil paints. So other artists as well transitioning who are using this quantum blur effect. Roman Lipsky, I don't have an example of his, I think, slightly abstract paintwork, but here you get an idea as well of, like, kind of, you know, the effects, and you can question, like, it does feel like a game, because I think you'll see later why. But you know, could this have been done classically? And the reason why that I think it's quite interesting to kind of pick up on the quantum blur effect is is that taking that idea from Perlin-Noyes as a way of creating that sort of terrain generation. And then, when we look at how we used to do it classically, using fractals. So I think, in some ways it's nice to see how we're kind of evolving, new different approaches for these new different expressions and paradigms and uses. Excuse me. So now we're on, I think, and I think having looked at these patterns and things, one thing I think that I find quite striking is that, even when you look around at different researchers, here we've got Edward Tufte, and he's sort of, I think, the kind of godfather of data visualization. I'm certainly a fan. I encourage you, if you're looking at how do you display data, we're in this information age, and he's quite taken by these Feynman diagrams, to the point he's, ditching the, well, not ditching the day job, but in his spare time he's creating these beautiful wire structures, inspired by these Feynman diagrams, right? And I think you can go and visit this. Can't quite remember where it is, somewhere on the East Coast, but I encourage you. And again, this is coming out of category theory. This is ZX calculus, and drawn out from there. And the quantum pictorialism that Bob Kirker is helping to kind of create and disseminating has been showing a lot of, I guess, a lot of success with education, in terms of educating people who may not know all the maths, or may not, be, I don't know, in grad school, for instance, but at school. And I think the nice thing here to highlight is, like, the researchers, the professors, the people kind of looking at how we can visualize these things differently. And that, I think, when you're thinking about your creative practice, or how we're going to create, things like, maybe someone could create a program where you can kind of code in this way. I don't know, like, maybe it captures you, maybe you're fine with all the other notation. I guess now, just kind of like harnessing in quickly from the quantum processes, using like algorithms. So this is a quantum Fourier transform. I thought it was quite nice because it's, there's a lot of use cases for it. It's quite familiar if you're familiar with quantum information theory or quantum computing. And here, Maciek has used it. You can find this on a GitHub repo as well. Just to create a quote, a way of generating images, and he's put it at different resolutions. And maybe there's something there, maybe there isn't, but it's that exploration right now. Whilst we were doing that, I kind of was like, okay, how can we kind of visualize this, in Python? Like, this was a way of kind of just saying, okay, like, what do they even look like? And I actually think that the quantum Fourier looks quite beautiful, almost decorative, kind of looks like some elaborate necklace and an elaborate leaf or something. And I think that's where we're kind of at, where there's such an open book of how you visualize things. And I think, there are companies like Classic as well, who are kind of helping you sort of build circuits in a way, in that kind of modular way that kind of, I think, has this layer that's more graphical. And I think that's where we're sort of careening towards, or if you're visually minded, is very exciting. Amy Carl is another artist who, she was commissioned by the Goethe Institute, and I think this is like entanglement, and she's got different sort of very beautiful pictures. Again, like, not to my knowledge necessarily using quantum, or maybe it is, but really it's like, how can we express these processes that are highly, highly relevant? And one thing, again, because we were talking about the sort of biocomputing, synthetic biology, she's someone that actually has a massive practice that's really stemmed in that field. I believe she was born with a heart defect and was in hospital a lot, and she's had to work with that. And I think she presents this very beautiful, balanced view with the sort of the good that quantum technologies and other emerging technologies can do. And I think that's really important to hold on to, because sometimes it's all a bit doomsday, it's a bit scary. And this is a lovely segue into Eduardo and Miranda, who probably, if you've already been sort of nudging around to see what are the frontier, what are the pioneering works going on when we're talking about creative expression, and Eduardo Miranda would be one of those. But interestingly, I think he's got a PhD in AI and sort of music. Actually, biocomputing is something that has transfixed him. I think it's his handle or something as well. And I think that his boldness to go into all these different realms and then to actually become an expert in them, I think, is very formidable. And I think also shows that, just because you choose the quantum pathway doesn't mean you should neglect what else is going alongside. And here is just a nice sort of demonstration of, we've got Craftwork and how pioneering, I think, with what tools they were building and what Eduardo is really pushing for. And he's recently released sort of a quantum an AI kind of album using a quantum computer. I believe it uses Quandela. I think that's photonics. So also interesting, like, can we start hearing what like certain modalities? Is there going to be a difference, or is it just going to be capped off? And this leads into that sort of avant-garde kind of music, which I think is something just to pick up on, is like, are we going to have aesthetics or auditory experiences that sort of quantum computers lend themselves to, like thinking about the randomness or thinking about what the properties they can do. So I just sort of stuck the quantum Fourier transform because we'd already looked at it, and it's kind of like, okay, is the reason music is making more headway than the others, is that because it looks like music notation and on some sort of subliminal messaging, it's just coming across as like, oh, you must do music, you must do music. And here's Scott O'Shero, who's plays the flute, and I think that's again showing you that, okay, he's got a PhD in the field, but he's still using these classical instruments as well. And how do we move on to this kind of audio visual? There's people at hackathons at IBM here who are creating that audio visual experience. Like, could that be drawn out more? I'm putting this very quickly, and I know I'm mindful of time, and that's really just to highlight that, actually, OCH and Scott here, they do a lot around jazz, and maybe that sort of unpredictability, lends itself to that. I encourage you to listen, to try and see what different people are coming up with. Okay, so what can we do that's unique about quantum like technologies or quantum computing? And I think the thing that got mooted around was quantum orchestra, and obviously when I'm googling around again, I get hit, and apparently this is a beer balanced by science, but it's a quantum orchestra. I think maybe we just have to look at drinks packaging, and it's going to be telling us what's coming down the pipe. I think when we think about quantum orchestra, I think it's interesting because there are lots of people around the world thinking about it, and maybe it makes sense. Maybe because you have this idea of superposition and entanglement, maybe this is something we should pushing. And I think here, when we're trying to develop out tools, I think when you look at, say, the seminal sort of Mike and Ike book and their definition of entanglement, it's sometimes prudent to actually look at, say, a different definition from a different domain. Here, we're looking at the more visualization domain and that human computer interface, and I think that's where you kind of see those similarities. You can't go, okay, is that something there? I'm not conflating what they're doing, but it's like, if we want to express things, is this where we should be pursuing? And this is something that we do at Quantum Village a little bit, and it's like, how do you embed an instrument to make it quantum? How can we just start now? Actually, this idea of being hackery and trying, kind of, and having that kind of counterintuitive, we don't want to wait for the quantum computers. They're actually quite expensive as well if you're not in a lab. So what can we actually do? Where next? I've kind of put some sort of intuition pumps. Is it smart quantum gloves? You see a lot of people with these sort of gloves that you can move things around and harness, and maybe what is that form factor that you want to create? I think that's, don't feel limited. And I think here again, this is my colleague Mark Carney, who's been publishing around that kind of qubit instrumentation and entangling instruments, and what can we do? And we've been pushing things around using MIDI. I think Eduardo Miranda's doing the same. And it's like, how can we create this convergence so that maybe we can have this kind of orchestra, this truly global orchestra, right? And I think again, just like that interconnectedness, when I look at artists, they're all seeking that. Like, here's Holly Herndon that we'll delve into a bit deeper. She doesn't, to my knowledge, work with quantum, but maybe next year, because she's doing a ton of other stuff around AI, and she's I think comes from California, having studied music technology and so on. And so she's in that prime position, and she's got this EEG headset, and it's kind of that interface. Like, what is that going to be? I found this thing where you can have a laser put in your eye where you can then see different colors. Like, are we going to have, is this that sort of, again, this different interface of where your quantum creativity is going to sit? Nothing is off limits. I think taking Holly Herndon's work, they created something at the Serpentine. I unfortunately don't have the beautiful picture, but it's almost like an altar. It's almost like this religious experience. And it's really, this way that they're training on themselves. And they've got a company as well, called Spawning, where they're really trying to help artists. You can see if you've been trained, you can work with them so that they can help you make sure that you're not trained, and I think they've got a collaboration with, entities like Hugging Face that will promise not to train on your data if you request an opt-out. And, there are people from the artist community who are also trying to go like, what can we do to wrangle technology, not just be kind of subjected to being used. And here is Ilar, who is a beautiful singer, and they've created something as well using quantum and gen AI, and actually just self-training again, and that was quite recent. And I think you can see that flow of like where we're going, what are we doing. But just pulling back very quickly, I think when we look at the quantum canvas, which I think is what more people are wanting to think about, is like more like, what is that interoperability, what are those tools and things that we're going to be using, and then ultimately, like, what is the Mona Lisa of the 21st century going to be. We just used QC Paint that we're going to go into, and that's a group of quantum researchers and artists who are tackling this. They're asking. So thank you, QC Paint, because we sort of created our own sort of quantum inspired artwork. And here's just a little rundown on a recent paper they put out. I'm just mindful of time, so I'm going to skip very quickly, but I encourage you to sort of check it out. And they're expressing their processes, and what's quite interesting is they're also painting some of it with oil paint afterwards. So whoever was asking that question again was quite prescient. It's really something where, just because you're, touching a quantum computer doesn't mean you're foregoing the traditional world as well. And then again, how do we start doing this? Because I think, very quickly, this is kind of like where people are like, but how do I do it? And for us, at Quantum Village, for us, it's really been about how do we speak the language of other people, right? For the people that don't necessarily want to learn, I don't know, is it doing all the intro stuff to Qiskit? Not everyone can do it, not everyone has time. Maybe it just doesn't resonate. You don't want to go and become that quantum computing expert. You want to work with one. And so here we've converted it into JavaScript from the QC Paint, and we've been able to generate these fun images. That image before on the right, by the way, was actually a David Hockney, if any of you sort of art buddies are out there, collage of a telephone pole, which I thought was quite fun. And really here we're looking at what new perspectives are. And I've just taken a picture of mine, used the QC Paint, using the JavaScript copy that we developed. So you can just do that, as opposed to having to do the more complex method that's more tuned to say a physicist or quantum information theorist. And here, how are we creating that? And I guess these are the sort of considerations to sit on, really is that kind of, beyond what we can do now with quantum computers, what almost can we do to build those sort of paradigms in the connectivity? And that's kind of where, even I've done a little self-portrait. I've got the Laughing Cavalier, which is one of my favorite pictures, and sort of rejigged it. I think he looks better than I do. But, again, sort of like, how can we start looking from these different perspectives? Look back as well, because sometimes looking back, you can see, I'm almost like the sort of Hockney collage here. That's kind of fun. And I didn't have to go and chop up, bits of photographic paper that I used to. So this is really, really good. This just gives you a quick deep dive on like how we're doing it in this process, and how you can then sort of pick out something that you see, an algorithm you see, like, what do you think's better? You probably have a better idea. Maybe QC Paint's not the way. Maybe there's some other library. You've already got ideas. And how can you create it that other technologists can then use your work? Again, here I was looking at the sort of, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Google Tilt brush that Google bought, and then they've since open source. But almost like when you're looking at the setup, it's quite obvious that it's almost like, a block sphere. It's all already drawn out. So like, how can we sort of create these interoperable kind of approaches that are already there? Like there's already a lot, I think, that can be done. And then here's something that we've done quickly for fun. You've got AlgoRave. Let's do quantum AlgoRave. And that's something we're open sourcing. And that's something I encourage you to, also come up with your own ideas. What needs to go quantum? I think just ending, we're at the end massively. And for me, I think it's actually the back end stuff that really, when we think about the quantum money paper, where a lot of the quantum protocols do stem from, um, actually, maybe this is, when we talk about ownership and who created it, these 2 points, in a world, I guess I've put NHI, that's non-human identities, in a world that we're going to have all these agents, when we're going to not know who created it, who owns it, maybe this is where actually quantum technologies provides the best use. Maybe it's time for someone to create quantum NFTs. And this is really just like, kind of how can you start brewing your own applications in art and the creative industries? What does Web 4.0 need? What is that interoperability so that other artists can use it? And this is just, ending almost on these kind of, again, I'm just putting this interface, interoperability, like think about how you can use these technologies there, because I think these are the layers around authenticity and identity that are important. And at the end of the day, art is often, that human inquiry, that it's about the human's response. You've got the machine, but what does the human want? What do they need? And will it be accessible? And also for fun, like what style? Like what is the kind of quantum art style, those quantum paintbrushes when they come out? Like what are they going to be like? I don't really know. That's hopefully where you guys come in. And then again, this is just some little sort of interesting resources that might be helpful. Sometimes look back to go forward. Fashion, Faith, and Fantasy by Roger Penrose might have more clues than you think. But then, Advances in Quantum Computer Music by Eduardo Miranda, equally a great sort of jumping off point of like what hasn't been done and what needs to be done. But on that note, I think I'm over time. But thank you very much, and I hope that was helpful or maybe interesting at the least.
It's very interesting. I don't know if there's time for me to like rapid throw some questions on you. I don't know how strict the timing is.
I'm
Uh,
happy to answer questions if there are any.
okay, I'm gonna throw I think this one's kind of standard. Somebody asked about so there's an upcoming sorry, thunderstorm here.
Oh,
Upstorm.
well, I've been
Uh,
coughing, so it's your turn.
okay, I'll just speak loudly.
I can hear you fine.
There's an upcoming hackathon, the Flick hackathon going on, and there's a lot of creative challenges in there. There's even like an art track. Um, what lasting impact do you hope these quantum creative challenges could have on participants' careers or perspectives?
I think honestly, if you can think outside the box, even think efficiently, like if you're looking for a job, even in a different domain, and like actually, if there's a clear sort of reason and clever, like I think people can pick up on that, and for maybe a good thing nugget to hear, when I've been going through some of the repos just to see like what is out there, like what's someone done 5 years ago. More often than not, they've kind of ended up going somewhere else, or I was like, oh, why did this chap stop, doing this in 2021? And he's been at Jane Street for 4 years. So, okay, it's finance is a different area, and in some cases, they're off building a quantum computer now. There's more urgency on that. So I definitely think don't feel limited, don't necessarily look at what is already being done, but also like look at other areas. How can you maybe intersect even with something like that sort of AI driven or something that can show if that's the passage you want to take that can demonstrate that.
Right. I am curious about this in terms of usage of the art. Do you think, in terms of interfacing with a quantum computer, do you think there'll be a lot of quantum art to make like UIs
Uh,
in the
oh,
quantum
what to
computer?
like create them? Do you?
Yes, to create them so that it like is more interactable with the how the quantum
Oh,
computer
I think
functions.
I definitely, what, I definitely think more is needed. I think it's sort of coming. I think you know, um, the design lead at Classic, she's doing a really fantastic way of kind of bringing that more kind of blocky approach. And I think, the feedback that you're seeing from people that are looking at these different approaches, is certainly helping. And then at the end of the day, like if you're not making it easy to use, you're limiting your customer base. So I think that like companies will get more experimental and will seek out people to be more experimental. I think that they're in that, quantum computers are still quite young, so they might be a bit timid, but I'm sure there's going to be some bold opportunities. And maybe from the hackathon, definitely there's the opportunity where someone could create a dashboard that's cool or has a little scratch pad that self gives you a bit of expression.
Yeah, that's cool. I'll throw in one last question. Don't want to keep you. This is a question somebody asked earlier. I didn't get to throw it in there. They're asking, you're bringing up a lot of different like artistic domains, visual art, music, storytelling. Which area are you seeing the most momentum in like quantum having an effect on it?
Uh, I think probably the bit, and maybe this is not helpful, but I definitely think in terms of art domains, is that correct?
Yes.
Um, I think probably just the idea and the concept of quantum mechanics, the idea of the concept that, we're going to get this sort of new type of computing. And like, I think there's a sort of fear, but also a kind of, this wonder that definitely you can see just by the commissions that are going on that classic artists are getting commissioned to do it. I think that's the bit. And I think hopefully we will that will make people comfortable, I think, going into that
Mm,
sciencey space, and then we move into the tech. One of the biggest issues that I didn't cover in the presentation, but that I do often tout, is that one of the difficulties with digital art is preservation. So we know how to preserve like a marble statue, like actually by design, marble's very durable usually, and if you keep it in the right condition. Whereas actually, a lot of museums or curators, they actually, they have issues whereby they'll acquire the art, and then there'll be a software update, or the software is then discontinued, and then you can't update it, and then you can't run the art. So does the art then lose value? So I think there's also something there in that, unless we figure out a way, and this is across the board for I think all kind of tech art, we figure out a way of kind of like preservation, of storage, of, and I guess that creates that same kind of feeling of that, when we were talking about like, kind of like the identity and the value and these sorts of themes. It's kind of the same. So maybe there's something in, the quantum technology kind of realm that they're going to come up with. Like if you've got a really, robust encryption method or a way of kind of preserving it, and then you have the instructions and backup and whatever. Maybe that's the answer.
right. I just commenting that's really interesting because in thinking about it like a quantum computer, those things I imagine the hardware is going to get outdated faster and in different ways than a classical computer where you can't actually run these past algorithms the same way you would.
Yeah. Yeah, there's lots to think about there, really. And especially if
Yeah.
you're trying to create kind of like art of value, or, kind of memorialize something, like, maybe you just have to put it in like kind of a clear plastic kind of block, formaldehyde, like Damien Hirst. And then, you kind of, he's been able to preserve animals. So maybe from a sculptural point of view. I'm sure people out there are going to come up with much better ways of encoding and preserving, because I think that's an important need.
That's cool. Well, I think that's my last question. Thank you so much for your time. That was a great
Hey,
presentation.
I'm glad you enjoyed it, and thank you for having us. And I hope it's helpful. And I think good luck to anyone doing the hackathon. I'm excited to see the outputs.
Yeah, good luck.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learnt something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the e-shop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for good.